Okay, well, welcome to LPAC Shorts. This is a new feature on the LPAC website where from time to time when issues pop up, we're going to have short discussions to try and sort through some of the controversial issues of the day and things that we have something to say about, which is of interest and of necessity in order to try and make sense of some of the crazy things that are going on around us in the world. So today we have Mike Stager, and Mike, I wanted to raise this issue with you because I know you've got some interesting things to say about it. But it seems to be that there's a sort of an assault on rationality coming from every different direction in the United States today, and actually globally. But what we're concerned about is how to deal with this in the United States primarily. And I'm speaking of, critical race theory, which is being shoved down people's throats, the 1619 Project, in which is irrationally being asserted that the United States is founded on racism and slavery and completely disregards everything about the American Revolution and the principles of the American Revolution, or the climate theory, the idea of climate change and the inevitability of climate change when, prominent scientists, I point recently to the book by Stephen Koonin, a climate scientist who was in the Obama administration, where he just cites the evidence from the global warming folks at the IPCC and elsewhere, and shows that there is not an imminent danger of climate change. Some of the crazy anti-science ideas which were pushed on the United States and on the population in the name of science around the COVID crisis. So there's like one irrational thing after another, which has no basis in reality, no basis in reason, no basis in fact. And yet the answer from the left and the liberals and the big tech and the oligarchical elite in the United States and Europe is that, this is the law. You must obey it. You have to accept it. And if you don't, you're some kind of right-wing crazy who is anti-science, et cetera, et cetera. It's very reminiscent of sort of the attacks on Kepler and the Renaissance scientists who rejected the idea of the Ptolemaic version of the universe. And throughout history, we see examples of this. And of course, people are reacting to this in a somewhat understandable way by piecemeal taking this thing and that thing, making arguments about why critical race theory is actually racist, why the attacks on the United States are wrong, the whole idea of the climate science, so forth. And they get up in arms, and they're right to do so. But it's like swatting flies. You're going after one irrationality after another irrationality after another irrationality. And so the real question is that I'd like you to talk about is how do you make sense of all this irrationality? What's a rational approach to dealing with all this craziness that's being thrown at us?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a good introduction. Let me say two things, or let me start with the first. The entire political left is not just bankrupt today, which is typical. Most conservatives would agree with that. But there's something else here. The left today, and it's probably been true for over 50 years, is counter-revolutionary, meaning they are supporting global fascism. And the questions of critical race theory or wokeness, identity politics, gender politics, all these questions, as you describe them, they're kind of like flies in the air. You can chase after them and you can try to deal with them. But the reason why, and this goes back to Noam Chomsky, even commentators on YouTube like Jimmy Dore can smell this. He can smell the young Turks pushing a perpetual war policy. Chomsky, same policy. But the root of this The root of this is the question of greenism, the green doctrine. Now, everybody likes clean water and clean air. But the real question is, when you assert that human beings are causing existential destruction to the planet, if you tolerate that at all, and you can blame Chevron or Mobil and say, or these fossil fuel companies and their corporations, and corporatism is a problem. And corporations are a problem. But the biggest justification for global corporatism today, for fascism globally, is greenism, the entire environmentalist movement, because its premise is that some people, some subset of the human species, or all of the human species, or some subset is the problem. And what you now have amongst all of the left doctrines, it's been going on for decades, and it's by nature counter-revolutionary, meaning it's actually supporting this global cartel, is to decide who is the subset that is now responsible for all the evil. Is it white men? Is it just whiteness? Is it some ethnicity? But if you premise the idea that human beings are the problem, and it's not, and then you clearly have expressed the most ancient and archaic oligarchical view of man one could possibly express. And it's not surprising for all of those very well-intended, good people that identify as on the left, that you want good things, you want healthcare, you want jobs, you want better wages, you don't want hyperinflation, you don't want the wars. That's all fine. But when you look at the sponsors of this global green agenda, it is Soros, it is Bloomberg, it is Gates, it is the biggest billionaire and financial oligarchs globally. And people have become tools of that. And their policies will shut down and are shutting down power plants. They're shutting down ones currently operating, nuclear, coal, oil. They will continue to prevent the construction of these power plants. The lack of power plants is the main source of pollution and waste and destruction of resources around the world. And if we don't stop this policy, and we don't get a coalition of the willing to grow, to develop, to build, and break from this counter-revolutionary, meaning fascist oligarchical perspective of climate change, of CO2 as a pollutant, of energy production is bad, fossil fuel bad. These notions are so contrary to human reason that they could only create a threat to civilization. And if we continue it, we'll end up using whale blubber because the windmills will be rusted and shut down. The electric cars won't be running because there'll be no place to charge them. And we'll be slaughtering whales again for some type of lamp oil to see in the dark ages that we'll be living in. And if people on the left don't confront this insanity, and if the broader majority don't recognize this as the leading front of corporatism, it's basically their marketing agenda, has been for 50 plus years, and they're stuffing it down the throats, and it's becoming such a commonly accepted thing that the debate now is not whether that's true or not, but the question of which subset of people are we going to blame for the destruction. And ultimately, we have to decide, how are we going to change our sense of society, our sense of the future, in concert together? There is no set of human beings which are the problem. The ideologies are the problem. Some ideas are just false, hence ideologies, false doctrines. But no set of human beings are the problem. Human beings are the most profound creation on this planet and in this universe. And if we operate from that cultural perspective, we're much more likely to find solutions to the current political crisis.
Yeah, that's very, very well said. And I just would like to point out that that's exactly the point that Lyndon LaRouche made throughout his entire career, but especially in his intervention in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, where he took on this whole question of the left as being counter-revolutionary fascist and pointed out that it was being supported by the highest levels of the Anglo-American elite, including the royal family, which is nothing but a bunch of environmentalists. I mean, Prince Philip was the head of the World Wildlife Fund and a profound environmentalist, and his son, Prince Charles, we all know about his tree-hugging, anti-human tendencies. But that this is adopted, that this crazy, really fascist anti-human policy is adopted by people who consider themselves to be people interested on leftists who are interested in so-called human rights. And, you know, you see the same thing where all of a sudden all these big liberals are big supporters of the CIA and the NSA and the spine and the endless wars and everything else. So this raises a second question, which I wanted to address. I think you alluded to it, was it's not just counter-revolutionary. I guess it is, if you want to say counter-revolutionary, in the sense of counter the American Revolution and the principles of the American Revolution. So this is all being used to sort of gin up a real anti-American sentiment and a false idea of what the American Revolution actually was and what America really is founded on and what its principles are, and instead to try and create an American hate movement among Americans. So you had some interesting things to say about how this counter idea was actually the basis of the American revolutions going back
Right.
to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So why don't you fill us in on that?
Well, yeah, I think that's the important point. When I say revolutionary, I speak of it not from a Jacobin, French, Soviet, Leninist, or Maoist Chinese cultural revolution. Those were the same thing. They were by nature run by black, or the oligarchical factions. Sometimes they refer to it as black nobility, but it's generally this globalist fascist grouping backing these supposedly revolutionary movements, but are by their nature fully destructive and threats to civilization. These are not organic uprisings within people. They are by their nature synthetic. You contrast that to the American experience, the American Revolution, which was in the making for nearly 200 years. The first solid settlement was the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were essentially blue-collar farmers who came here and had the wherewithal and the resilience and the commitment to grow within civil and religious liberty. And they were basically then subsumed by what became about a decade later the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston, led by John Winthrop. And when you look at Winthrop gave this sermon on the Arabella ship, or prior to their departure from England, or on their arrival into Boston, whatever the circumstances might have been, it was probably a written sermon and distributed. He captures at the very notion of a society which can survive under extreme circumstances, that the very ligaments and tendons of a society that hold individuals together is a love of one another, is a love and participation as a humanity in our overall progress. And he recognizes that as the very foundation and premise of what they're going to shape there, what he describes as the city upon a hill. That's kind of the often referred to section of the speech or sermon. But this idea that we take concern for one another, that we celebrate our victories together, this idea, that is what has been developing around Donald Trump. And a lot of people, because Trump doesn't express the aesthetics that they prefer, reject what he is attempting to create, which is a kind of union and unity amidst the American people. Regardless, and you saw this even in the last election, you saw the different demographic groupings actually responding to this idea of universal nature of human value, of growth, of manufacturing and development, that we could, in joining together in a brotherhood as a nation, we can solve real problems and we can make great contributions to the world. And that was going back over 400 years, the very essence of how this nation began. And it is the means by which we actually fulfill the revolutionary opportunity we have today to bring that essence, that spirit of the American Revolution back into American politics, into American policy and leadership. And I would call on all Americans to recognize the unique opportunity we have today, that the ferment in the population is real, and that it's among the working class, the blue collars, the people out there that are productive, who work hard and want that civil and religious liberty to live life in a sense of unity and brotherhood with mankind, contributing something useful, not simply for their own personal gain, not the Wall Street mentality, but a sense of pulling a nation together. That's what's truly revolutionary within human existence. All these other doctrines are false, and the premise of all of them is the insidious and scientific fraud of climate change, carbon dioxide, and so-called the idea that we have to restrict our energy production. There is nothing more satanic on this planet and undermining to human value and human success than that ideology.
Well, that's very good, and the reference to Winthrop is very important, and I would urge everyone to get to look at that sermon, because it's quite inspiring and gives you the actual philosophical basis of what the American Revolution was about. And I think we can post a link to it or post the actual sermon on our website so that our viewers can see it. Well, I think that's a good thing to present. Really happy to have you join us on LPAC Shorts. And this is, as I said, going to be a regular feature on the LPAC website when people have something important to say about the events that are occurring in the world today. And we want to present it in a short, concise manner, as Mike just did. We'll do it. So thank you very much for joining us, and tune in next time for LPAC Shorts.